Now turn to item 2 on our order paper, leave to introduce, and I call on the Honourable Member for Ramsey, Dr Allinson, to move.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There are many times over the past 5 years when I've had to pinch myself when looking around this chamber and again realise the trust and responsibility bestowed upon me by the people of Ramsey. It's easy to get involved in the minutiae of complex legislation, to respond to crises and be lobbied by special interest groups, losing perhaps the essence of why we are given the privilege of being here. Our key role is to represent our constituents, whether that is assisting them with personal matters, responding to their concerns, reflecting their views on policy and national circumstances, or raising questions to hold government to account. But our other important role is to form, amend and pass legislation, laws and regulations which help strengthen the structure and function of how our society operates. This involves debating bills which improve the lives of all of our constituents, which correct previous omissions, or advance progressive reform of the way people are treated and respected on our island. It is a great honour and privilege for me to stand before you today and ask for leave to introduce a private member's bill. Such bills are often brought forward on important social issues where the respective government department is unable or unwilling to propose legislation, often due to competing priorities or a lack of clear policy development. I'm grateful for discussions with the Minister for Health and Social Care on the motion I bring today, and for the support of other members over the past few years as we have developed conversations and understanding around the issues involved. It may appear unusual for a minister to rise and propose such a motion. We are a small but effective parliament, and many of us strive to fulfil multiple roles. But there are some public interest issues that clearly defy departmental responsibilities and speak to the very core of how our nation balances the rights of an individual with the common good. Language is very important, and I would like to start by stressing what assisted dying is and what it is not. I have cared for dying patients as part of my work as a doctor and provided palliative care to people and their families in hospital and at their homes. I've also held the hands of close friends and family members as they've died of cancer and other terminal diseases. None of these people wanted to die. Many endured painful operations, treatments and procedures to try and buy some time in the hope that their treatments might be successful and that modern medicine might triumph over disease. Medical knowledge continues to advance. We're diagnosing more cancers and diseases earlier, fast-tracking effective treatments, and have an arsenal of medications to prolong life. And yet sometimes this is not enough. Sometimes all the best support, pain relief, treatment and empathy cannot help lessen the existential angst of your impending death. I say your death because I would like all of you to take a few brief seconds to imagine yourself in the situation many of you will have already witnessed in others. What support, choice and options would you wish for yourself? Assisted dying allows a dying person the support and choice to have control over their own death if they decide their suffering is unbearable. It involves a defined system where terminally ill, mentally competent adults can be prescribed life-ending drugs to administer themselves after meeting strict legal safeguards. The choice is available to over 200 million people around the world. The Death in Dignity Act was passed in Oregon in 1994, and subsequently numerous other American states have developed their own legislative systems. Canada passed their Medical Aid in Dying Act in 2016, followed by the Australian states of Victoria and Western Australia. What assisted dying doesn't include is the direct administration by health professionals of medicines to end life. This is often termed voluntary euthanasia and is available in several European countries, including Belgium, Luxembourg and Netherlands. We must also differentiate assisted dying from what is sometimes referred to as assisted suicide. This is where assistance is given to people with long-term progressive conditions, but not with a terminal illness, to end their lives. Switzerland has this model, and the work of the organisation Dignitas has been widely recognised. Assisted dying is about assisting and supporting a person facing their own imminent death. As I've said, none of these people want to die, but they also find themselves in a situation where they desperately want to have control over how, when, and where they pass away. Now, assisted dying is not an alternative or some sort of rival to palliative care. The work of Hospice Isle of Man, our community services, and care by all the staff at Nobles Hospital should be recognised and celebrated. Our hospice, which cares for patients and their families, both in a building next to Nobles Hospital and with the outreach work and hospice at home provision throughout our community, does an incredible job. The modern hospice movement was founded by Dame Cicely Saunders in 1967, when St Christopher's Hospice was set up in South West London. She introduced effective pain management and insisted that dying people needed dignity, compassion and respect. She also argued for research into treatment of dying patients, and we've seen the growing evidence base for prescribing and treatment options offered. Saunders introduced the idea of total pain, which included physical, emotional, social and spiritual distress. She initially faced opposition from the mainstream medical profession, who found her approach of concentrating on the individual and their experience quite radical. But even with all the work done by hospice and our NHS, there will be some people who are still in pain, who still dread the loss of autonomy and the indignity of a death full of suffering. It is for these individuals that assisted dying can provide another option. I recognise that many people find this a difficult subject to discuss. There are some vehemently opposed to such legislative reform who may contact you to convey their concerns and fears. I respect their views and will try to address these concerns, but at the same time would like to stress legislation to allow for assisted dying is fundamentally about the individual, not the collective. It is about personal circumstances and a single person's suffering rather than more overall health policy. That ability to try to imagine yourself in somebody else's shoes can be difficult, but it is sometimes essential for us, as Tynwald, to create the right legislative framework for the people of our island. Assisted dying is not some sort of extension to the discredited Liverpool Care pathway. This pathway was set out to establish clear treatment options for dying patients and standardised care. It was discredited because all too often in the hospitals across, the communication with relatives and, more importantly, the consent of patients was not sought. Assisted dying has at its core the informed choice, autonomy and valid consent of the individual, free of coercion or external pressure. Some people have warned that any introduction of such legislation is the slippery slope to a form of eugenics where the sick, the weak and disabled will be devalued and marginalised. I understand this fear, but there is no basis to it. Studies of numerous jurisdictions have shown that well-drafted legislation allows personal autonomy for competent adults to provide consent whilst protecting the vulnerable. Changes in legislation would have to come from this House, with the will of the people who place us here, and not inside offices of a hospital ward. There is no inevitability that passing such legislation has to lead to its remit being extended. In fact, we already have legislation to enable and protect those people with defined characteristics, such as mental or physical disability. Nor does this devalue in any way the contribution people with disabilities make to our community. Our diversity and differences make our society stronger, and investment in education, health and social care are the way to affirm this. Any legislation would clearly set out the residence criteria to avoid people moving to the island just to avail themselves of such a service. Some worry about the ability of medical professionals to predict imminent death or confirm a terminal diagnosis, but studies have shown that oncologists and family doctors who provide holistic care and know their patients are remarkably accurate in predicting how long a person still has to live. Some others have warned that passing assisted dying legislation would affect the trust the public has in the medical profession and lead to conflict with the island's doctors. the British Medical Association and Royal College of Nursing have both adopted a neutral stance. Rather than opposing legislation as professional bodies, they accept the different views of their members and respect their individual moral and ethical viewpoints. The vast majority of countries who have introduced progressive legislation providing support and assistance to those who are dying have ensured that clauses allowing for conscientious objection are the main tenet of their legal framework, and countries have developed a range of legal safeguards to guarantee the safety of both patients and staff. Rather than erode trust, many physicians who participate in schemes speak of the sense of privilege they feel being able to help patients and their families at one of the worst moments of their lives, and the gratitude felt when personal choice and dignity are respected and empowered. I have already contacted the General Medical Council and the Nursing and Midwifery Council for their views on how they would carve out special provision should our treatment of dying patients become more enlightened than on the adjacent aisle. When Tynwald had a general debate on assisted dying in January 2020, an MHK said the debate should not be rushed. This debate started decades ago, and in May 2003, the Honourable John Rimington asked for leave to introduce a private member's bill, as I do today. At the time, an amendment was passed to set up a select committee of 5 members to take written and oral evidence, and their extensive report was published in 2006. Since then, there have been Tynwald petitions, affirmative motions by Junior Tynwald, and in February 2015, the Honourable Member for Rushen, Mr. Dewan Watterson, also asked for leave to introduce a bill to amend the law with respect to assisted dying. Unfortunately, this was not successful at that time. Honourable members would have received copies of the previous report, which examined the arguments for and against legal reforms. Those arguments remain valid today. The only thing that has changed is now far more countries, especially belonging to the Commonwealth, have passed legislation and created safe frameworks to deliver healthcare services. We don't need another committee to examine the same issue, just the conviction to respond to changing public opinion and allow the debate to continue, but about an actual draft bill. I don't think that after 20 years of discussion, I could be accused of rushing this debate. Some may claim that there isn't enough drafting resource and that there are so many other important priorities. But by continuing to ignore this issue, we ignore the harm and damage already being done. An analysis published by the Office of National Statistics last month found that patients with serious long-term medical conditions, especially terminal cancers affecting the liver, esophagus, lung and pancreas, were twice as likely to suicide. We know this happens on our island. People desperately want to regain control over their bodies and resort to taking their own lives. But they do it alone, often violently, and without support or advice. We recognise the long-term effects this could have on friends and family. As a doctor, I'm restricted from advising a patient on assisted dying. Our current law classes any help or advice as an offence. Some of our island residents have joined Dignitas, and if they're rich enough, can arrange to travel to Switzerland and use their services. But they do so worried about what their relatives might risk questioning or prosecution on their return. Often they have to travel earlier than they would just to ensure that they're well enough to get on the plane. Honourable members, this is not an issue that's going to go away, nor a problem we can continue to seek to ignore. I believe now is the time for a real debate on legislation and how we could provide real choice for terminally ill, mentally competent adults who could be prescribed life-ending drugs to administer themselves after meeting strict legal safeguards. If successful today, I would intend to organise a full public consultation on the principles of future legislation over the summer, before returning with a draft bill at the end of this year for full scrutiny, debate and analysis. Using the Committee of the House approach, we could invite experts in their field to share their views and experiences and further refine our views as legislators for the good of our community. This decision cannot be delegated to others or to the courts. In 2019, Phil Newby, who had motor neuron disease, applied for a judicial review to determine whether the blanket ban on assisted dying in the United Kingdom was comparable with his human rights under Articles 2 and 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. The High Court refused this application, but the judgment handed down by Lord Justice Irwin and Mrs Justice May, the judges stated that in the context of repeated and recent parliamentary debate, where there is an absence of significant change in societal attitude expressed through Parliament, and where the courts lack legitimacy and expertise on moral as opposed to legal questions, in our judgment, the courts are not the venue for arguments which have failed to convince Parliament. In our judgment, there are some questions which plainly and simply cannot be resolved by a court, as no objective, single, correct answer can be said to exist. On issues such as the sanctity of life, there is no consensus to be gleaned from evidence. The private views of judges on such moral and political questions are irrelevant and spring from no identifiable legal principle. We struggle to see why any public conclusion judges might reach on matters beyond the resolution of evidence should carry more weight than those of any other adult citizen. As parliamentarians and legislators, we now have the opportunity to represent the people who placed us here, to ask for their views and wishes for the future. This is the first step in any meaningful change, and I ask for your support to step closer to a time when those dying on our island genuinely have choice, respect, and can receive any support they require. Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to beg to move the motion standing in my name.
Well, the Honourable Member for Douglas East, Mrs Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to second and reserve my remarks.
Honourable Member for Douglas North, Mr Ashford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My views on this have been on record for quite a long while, and in principle I have absolutely no issue whatsoever with this coming forward. And I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for, as he says, bringing forward something that has been a debate on and off for maybe 20 years, I think, in this honourable place. Where I've always had concerns is around how it actually works in practice, the protections. And that's one of the things that I'll be looking at very closely in relation to this bill. I'm more than happy to support leave to introduce today, but that shouldn't be read as me that I'm automatically going to support the bill, because it will very much depend upon what the text of the bill is. One of the things I'd like to ask the mover is, has there been any look at the potential burden on healthcare staff in relation to this? Because this is something else I've always been concerned about as well. And also in relation to what the Honourable Member has planned for consultation, because in relation to consultation, obviously the Honourable Member in the last House brought forward the Abortion Bill, now the Abortion Act, and it was very widespread consultation, because he mentioned about previous attempts, Mr. Speaker, for this coming forward and then it getting kicked off into the long grass of a committee or taken down the dark lane that Mr Thomas sometimes referred to and being strangled. But if there isn't widespread consultation on this, I could see that there will be a desire, potentially after second reading, to move it to a select committee, even if it is select committee with a time scale on. So I'm just wondering what the Honourable Member is proposing in terms of going out and garnering all those different views that he spoke about in order to ensure that everyone can have their say in relation to this and all viewpoints can actually be heard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Ramsey, Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Speaking as an individual MHK, my views on this issue are already on record. I know for myself I have seen friends and others suffering with the sorts of conditions that the Honourable Mover has described. And I know there are situations where I would myself not want to persist if I were the one suffering through some of those conditions. And I use the word persist here, Honourable Members, because I can't bring myself to describe their quality of life as living. Equally, I've known people living with severe degenerative illnesses who are living with a very good quality of life. But the point is, I would most certainly want that choice. So when it comes down to the principles underlying this proposal, I do agree with my honourable friend and colleague Dr Allinson that people should have the right to choose, and we should be looking for the right way to support people. But I do have a number of concerns about the proposal that I would appreciate a bit of comment on, I think, from the honourable mover. So putting my ministerial hat on just for a second, even if we did have the best law in the world, the health service is already going through a period of significant and substantial change and upheaval. So is now the right time for such a profound change as this? Operational capacity would be a very real concern, and I would very much appreciate some commentary and commitment from the Honourable Mover that should this bill progress, that he would work with the Department on how we ensure that the will of this House, whatever that ends up being, is properly delivered operationally. Also, I would extend an offer that if we can as a department support the consultation process to ensure it reaches as many people as possible, then I think that is something that we may be able to accommodate. Okay, ministerial hat off. I'd like to ask my honourable friend about his choice of words in his leave to introduce. He himself stated language is important. So he asked for permission to investigate a bill for adults who are terminally ill to be provided at their request with specified assistance to end their own life. So firstly, I'd be grateful if he could expand on what he means by adults. Does his proposed bill extend to those who may be under the age of majority but who are perfectly capable of making informed decisions themselves, and is this something he intends to consult on? I'd also be grateful for some expansion of the phrase terminally ill. People may be suffering long-term degenerative illnesses which may not itself be terminal or immediately terminal. It may be terminal sometime in the future. Does he not intend to encompass people who are suffering this type of long-term degenerative illness but who may not meet a very restrictive definition of terminally ill? In his speech, he also made clear the distinction between assisted dying and voluntary euthanasia. As I've said earlier today and in another debate in another place, I believe we should have a choice when it comes to how we pass on, and firmly believe that it is right and proper that we have this debate, and it is right that we encourage debate in the public on this issue to see what the Isle of Man viewpoint is. This shouldn't really be about whether we as individual members think we should explore this complex issue. We are here to serve the public, and so I would very much welcome public debate and engagement, even if the end result of that engagement is that we don't make any progress. And so my concern here is the language in the leave to introduce potentially restricts this debate, and I would be grateful if my honourable friend could outline whether he plans to consult on some of these broader issues as well as those that are implied directly by the language in his leave to introduce, to ensure we gather a true reflection of views from our island community on this complex issue. And lastly, Dr Allinson mentioned in his speech about properly drafted legislation providing safeguards, and I think, like has already been alluded to by the previous speaker, this absolutely has to be central to any consultation and any bill that comes forward. As I said earlier, if I was in this position where the law would be an aid to me, I would absolutely want this to be my choice. And that's the problem nobody has really resolved. The people this proposal would help the most are often those people who are least able to make the decision at the time it needs to be made, or least able to take action themselves when action needs to be taken. So how do we protect those individuals? How do we ensure it is truly their choice, not the choice of family members or others who are making a decision because they think it is best? And how do we ensure that when people make this choice, they are doing it entirely of their own free will and are properly supported to ensure this really is the right choice for them? So I would be very grateful if the Honourable Mover could expand a little bit on how he sees this working in practice and how he intends to ensure that the rights of the individual are paramount and people who are in this vulnerable position are protected. I'm very happy to support the leave to introduce request that is in front of us today, but I would definitely caveat this in terms of some of the issues I've outlined and in terms of the safeguards that end up coming forward and on that absolute requirement for full and proper engagement with the Manx public.
On the Honourable Member for Glenfaber and Peel, Mrs Lord Brennan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think it's helpful that the Honourable Mover has outlined clearly the narrowness of the scope of this motion, because I think that perhaps has not been understood on the outside. But I do share the points raised so far about how really about how things will work in practice, and about how the consultation will be carried out, because to me this is so serious, this is so heavy, it's not something that is going to necessarily lend itself well to what you can think to be a standard government consultation. And I think that in some of the representations that I know that I've received in my constituency, that the points about the concerns of medical staff, about how safeguarding is in place, and about about how this might also impact the Isle of Man in a broader way, and also about the ability of the services to cope with this, are all things I think are going to need to be dealt with and addressed and really thought about very carefully. And so I would like to hear some comfort as to how that will be approached. So this is really about engagement, I think, rather than consultation. Some honourable members in this House will not know that, when I first joined Tynwald in the Legislative Council, the first bill that came to us was the abortion bill. And actually having to deal with that then, which was effectively coming through quite a new House of Keys still, 2 years into that administration. I certainly think that from a legislative point of view, both from a pre-legislative point of view and also then down the line and looking at it from a post-legislative point of view, I do think that it actually would have been beneficial perhaps to have had a committee. Now, I appreciate there's already been a committee, and I will be looking back at what the findings of that have been, because I do recognise that this is a debate that has been going on a long period of time. But aside from having a committee and looking at those findings, because it is a huge responsibility setting out on this, I think that there is a definite need to have clear policy in advance of legislation, and also that people should feel comfortable with that policy. I do have concerns, perhaps in some ways, based on, it's one thing to legislate. We can do that in many ways. Putting those words on a piece of paper, yes, it's necessary. In some ways, is that the easy part? Because the reality is that once that is done, it will not be enough just to stand back and think, right, that's it, it's done. We have to think about how things will work in practice, and it's certainly not the first time I've made those points to do with such significant pieces of social legislation. Anything that's significant in social legislation, let alone something that is effectively dealing with the final moments of death, is something that needs proper thought. I think that to progress this needs a huge amount of conviction to support it. I admire the Honourable Mover for having that. I think I will grapple to bring that conviction to support it today. So I will just make the point that whilst I respect that it's being brought forward, I would just say a huge responsibility. It's going to take a lot of careful work and careful consideration. This will have health service implications, it will have moral and ethical implications, and it will be very, very testing and a very sensitive subject to deal with. We can perhaps all think of all the situations where, if you've known somebody, or perhaps a relative, perhaps a father, and actually they may have well taken that choice if it was available to them. But actually, well, what else might you have missed out on if they had been able to take that choice? So that's why it's not just enough to look at the law. We absolutely have to think about how this will work in practice. So I hope some thought can be taken, not only by the mover, but actually this House in general, as to the sorts of considerations and care that are required on this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, the Honourable Member for Erin Michael, Mr Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the Honourable Member for Ramsey, Dr Alex Allinson, for bringing forward this motion. I will be supporting this motion today on the fundamental basis that I believe it is right. It is the right of an individual suffering from a terminal illness to decide on their own life and within the boundaries of the law how it is lived, and ultimately, within all the necessary safeguards, yet to be fully explained, how it ends. As a society, we are not very good at talking about death, and yet surely we all aspire for a good life in whatever form that takes. So why wouldn't we want to aspire to a good death? That does not mean, of course, in any way that people today do not have the opportunity of experiencing a dignified and compassionate end. The work of our medical professionals and hospice have provided individuals and their loved ones with care and compassion for many years, something my family have experienced in recent years with my father. I will never forget the kindness and professionalism of the amazing team at Hospice Home Care who helped us through those last days. I have had correspondence from those who feel that promoting assisted dying in some ways damages the principles of palliative care, with this somehow questioning the fact that many people do pass away in as comfortable and pain-free way as possible due to amazing care. Of course, thankfully many do, but not all, and as pain is seen as quite subjective, some may want to have the option not to face that if it was available. Interestingly, though, looking at the data and research, and it is comprehensive, pain or pain management is not the principal reason for choosing an assisted death. Much higher in people's minds are loss of autonomy, not being able to enjoy life, and loss of dignity. These factors surely relate to the basics of a quality of life that a person fears losing, and I believe the individual should be allowed to make that choice, as long as it is clearly their choice and in the face of a terminal illness with a reasonably estimated prognosis. Clearly, if this motion passes today, it is only the start of a long journey to create the relevant assisted dying legislation, and there are many issues to address and sureties to put in place. Some other points, but not all, would be ensuring the core principles are enshrined in primary legislation, understanding how patient information is gathered and recorded, what entities will be potentially required to do that, how data is reported and when, what minimum age requirements for patients would be in place. There are many more questions that will need to be examined and understood, and I do want the opportunity for that to happen. So again, I thank Dr Allinson for bringing this motion, and I will be supporting it today. Thank you.
Call the Honourable Member for Garth, Mr Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Many honourable members will be aware of my long-standing commitment to the Salvation Army, a Christian church and international charitable organisation. The Salvation Army has been actively fighting social equality and transforming lives for over 150 years, almost 140 years in the Isle of Man, and is currently active in 132 countries. It assists thousands of vulnerable people every day. Our mission statement says that we will meet human needs without discrimination, and our services are offered freely to all, regardless of gender, race or sexual orientation. We have an equality and diversity policy which covers all protected characteristics under equality law and which applies to every aspect of our service provision. As a freely committed member to the Salvation Army, I obviously fully subscribe to and entirely support its doctrines and philosophy. I would therefore oppose the introduction of any legalisation in support of assisted dying, assisted suicide or euthanasia in the Isle of Man. We often hear the argument, just vote through the principle and the rest can be worked out later. But as with many things, as we have heard from other honourable members today, the devil is in the detail, and this statement can be very easily be linked to leave be given to introduce. Very often a wish to die stems from loneliness or from those with an acute perception of being a burden. Loneliness can be strongly associated with long-lasting depressive symptoms. To others, it may be isolation or despair. Mr Speaker, unlike many parts of the UK, our island has access to a very broad and well-established palliative care provision. Our healthcare professionals working within all aspects of our healthcare system dedicate their lives to caring for others. It is not just a profession, but their vocation. They have chosen to care for others, and part of that care is to show compassion, diagnose the medical symptoms, and then often battle to prolong life and save life. The onset of dying should be acknowledged, and when treatment becomes ineffectual and illness irreversible, the focus should change from the struggle against disease to that of caring for the dying. Assisted dying is illegal in England and Wales, and although there is no specific crime for assisted suicide in Scotland, it is possible that helping a person to die could lead to prosecution for murder, culpable homicide or reckless endangerment. In the Republic of Ireland, the recent Dying with Dignity Bill has failed for the second time, the first failure being in 2015. The Isle of Man is therefore surrounded by nations with duly elected parliamentarians, all of whom currently repudiate the possibility of assisted dying in any form. Whilst sharing the genuine anxieties and abhorrence that people have concerning inadequate care, unrelieved suffering and inappropriate treatments, I maintain that these can be overcome without resort to euthanasia. The hospice movement has shown that pain can be eliminated or considerably eased in almost all cases with the proper administration of drugs and other treatments. Sophisticated palliative skills are also available, while expert counselling can relieve the emotional and psychological turmoil that is often associated with the approach of death. Mr. Speaker, no human life is pointless or worthless. Everyone is precious. We often speak about our island as an integrated community where we regularly witness genuine deeds of kindness and where social responsibility is often demonstrated. Care is in the community and should not be just left to the care professionals. We should all have a moral conviction that it is important to communicate by word and deed to the sick, the elderly, the despairing and the dying that they are worthy of respect, they are loved and they will not be abandoned. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Call on the honourable member for Arby Castamouly, Mr. Glover.
Guru Mai Lord. This is a very tricky one. We have got very mixed views on this, and I think those mixed views will be very representative of very mixed views among my constituents on this topic. My words, you will get plenty of correspondence on this. It will be like the abortion debate at the last House, the last Tynwald, and there will be very divided views across the community on this, and strongly held and passionate views about this. I share the concerns about the safeguards that Douglas North, MHK, Mr. Ashford mentioned, and that really does need to be looked at. I would like to be able to support this leave to introduce, but I want to ask some very specific questions before I can do that, because there are two certainties in life. We talk about taxes, so why shouldn't we talk about death? But I have concerns that is this the right time? We've got very big issues before us at the moment. This didn't come up on the doorstep during the election campaign, not within Arbury, Castletown and Maloo, the doors I knocked on, whereas housing did, whereas cost of living did, all of these issues that we're really having to address now. And I just am concerned, particularly, and I fully respect Dr Allinson for bringing this forward, but he is in a very responsible position as Treasury Minister at the moment, and this is going to take a considerable amount of time. So I think we do need to talk about it, but I'm just questioning, is this actually the right time to be bringing this legislation forward? And I also feel, because there will be people, previous speaker, with religious beliefs and moral views on this, that those views need to be taken forward. And I'm concerned that we need a much longer consultation period on such an important matter rather than just over the summer months. I think all members need to go out and talk to their constituents and be available and listen to comments. And I just feel we shouldn't rush this. I know we've talked about the fact we've been talking about this for many, many years now, but if we are to bring this legislation forward, I'd be concerned that that consultation must not be rushed, and I really want a guarantee that that's going to be the case for me to be able to press green. Otherwise I'm pressing red on this today. It does need to be a really serious consultation. I also wonder whether, because of the magnitude of the topic, this shouldn't be a private member's bill in any case. It should be a government-sponsored bill being brought forward with all the weight that that carries. There's other questions, I think, that needs us to be addressed, and I'd like to hear from the mover on this. He talked about talking with the General Medical Council and the nursing and midwifery organisations. Have those talks led to any suitable regulatory framework being put in place? Has that been agreed? Because that obviously is an area of concern before we even debate this, if it's the practicalities of it working. And we'd be alone as well. That's a slight concern as well. Other countries have talked about it, but the status quo has remained, and we would be an outlier to some degree. And is that going to be... Is that a concern to the mover with our international reputation? And I think the Department of Health at the moment, who would be the obvious party to bring this forward, have got other priorities as well, as I'm concerned about this coming in at this time. And the final point, and again I think it's really important that it's established before we start debating this, have we talked to UK authorities, would this even get royal assent if it was passed in the first place? Otherwise, if we hadn't made that issue and approached and got comment on that, we could be just wasting time anyway if a bill is passed and is then not going to get royal assent. So I'd like some answers, particularly on the consultation period, because I don't feel that that is long enough at all. Thank you.
Or the Honourable Member for Onchan, Ms Edge.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I wasn't sure I was going to actually say anything today, but having just looked through the Honourable Member for Ramsey, Dr Allinson's manifesto, I can't see anything indicated within it with regards to this private member's bill, which I would have thought would have been one of the key things that the voters would have had a right to know in September. I just want to take members back a little way. Dr Dorothy Panton, very, very well-known doctor on the island, donated her home as a hospice in Kensington Road. I didn't hear that mentioned today. That hospice stayed in place for many years, till 2007, when the current team raised, I think it was 4.5 million to move to new premises, which we all know are needed to help people at the end of their life. The two questions I'd like to ask the Honourable Member: would this medication, if you were successful in going through with your private member's bill and making this legal, you mentioned that it would be a couple of tablets that a patient could take at home. Would this be available as a national health prescription? What wraparound services would that individual have? We've got no wraparound services for many people suffering without the decision being taken to end their life. And I do have real concerns that this is a really important part, and I'm sure would be part of a consultation. I've had cancer. I know what that word means to people. Did my views change? Yes, they did. Am I still here today? Yes, I'm proud to say I am, and I hope I have many more years. However, at that moment in time, without the excellent services of Clatterbridge Hospital and the facilities of the Maggie Centre, could I have thought about things very different and not kept positive about what life is about? I feel it's very premature. Capacity for everybody can be different depending on a diagnosis. I had full capacity at that point in time, but I could have made decisions that my family didn't know about. Some of my family members didn't even know I was there for treatment. I feel this private member's bill is premature without our capacity legislation being in place to protect the most vulnerable, and without having confidence as to when that capacity legislation will be passed by this honourable court and upstairs. I don't feel that I can support the private member's bill coming forward today. I also have concerns, like the Honourable Member for Ramsey mentioned, with regards to the age of an adult. We have legislation that classes an adult at 16. We have legislation that classes an adult at 18. Perhaps the Isle of Man needs to decide what is the right age of an adult on the island and make sure all of our legislation is in line with that. And bringing in separate individual items of legislation without actually knowing what the definition of an adult throughout our legislation on the island is, I think is a dangerous road to travel down, and we need to have that clear as to what we are moving forwards with as to the age of an adult on the island, and ensuring that all of our legislation is aligned to that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Calling the Honourable Member for Rushden, Dr Hayward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. End-of-life decisions are extremely personal and for all of us a very emotive subject. None of us spend much time considering our own mortality or recognising that our time on this earth is very brief and fleeting. But that's the reality we face. There have been incredible medical advances in the last 100 years or so, and then progress in things like infrastructure and waste management and food security means human lifespans have been extended. And as a society, we're expecting to live longer, but we will all face the end at some point. Now, in some ways, we're a victim of our own success, because if we can stop people dying from those childhood diseases and we stop them dying of accidents on the way through because we have good health and safety legislation, all of those things contribute to a point where you get to a society that's facing the diseases of old age far more than we ever have done. And we've recognised that population bulge that's creating that larger section of society that's going to be facing these issues in the next few years. Faced with a terminal diagnosis, many people would like the ability to define what a good death looks like for them, and that's a very personal choice as well. As guardians of our legislation, it's within our power to help those who are facing those difficult times to make it easier for them to have the choice about what their death looks like. Of course, there need to be adequate safeguards, and the capacity bill that is coming will help enormously in this regard to define who has capacity to make the decisions about those. And there are some really clear sections to that will definitely reassure some people. We need to avoid any element of coercion, we need to avoid malign influences, but ultimately this is about creating the opportunity to choose a good death for those who it is appropriate for. And it's a choice that recognises that sometimes the almost aggressive medicalisation of the fate that's awaiting us all is not a choice that some of us want. We've recognised that an individual has a right to ask not to be resuscitated, but that step doesn't go far enough. You could ask not to be resuscitated, and then you could be sustained for a long period of time and then have food and water withdrawn and your morphine dose upped. And that would be a choice that some of us wouldn't want to go down. So this option won't be right for everyone, but that's not a reason to deny the choice. So I welcome the start of this process. I think it aims us towards providing a compassionate end-of-life option, and I think it will establish the Isle of Man as a jurisdiction that cares about our people throughout their lives and gives them the freedom to make that choice right up to the moment of their death.
Thank you. Call the Honourable Member for Erin Michael, Mr Cannon.
Thank you. I have two questions really for the mover of this bill this morning. The first is around the consultation and indeed the weight of consultation, and whether he believes or feels that that different groups may have a more powerful voice in this discussion, and whether there is any view around the voice of, say, a fit and healthy 40-year-old and the same voice of a 75-year-old having gone through that journey. In other words, in my 11 or so years as an MHK, in my years, I've found that people have changed views actually as they've got older, and it's sometimes all right to pronounce these sorts of things as a fit 40-year-old or 50-year-old, and yet I think that actually some people, by the time they get into their 70s and 80s, have different views about this matter. So I would like to know and understand what emphasis should be placed potentially in terms of consultation, understanding when it is both undertaken and when it comes back. And the second issue that I want to raise and to understand more is around this view of on a small island and having, if such a pathway ever were to exist, what impact that may have on those who were and felt that their lives should come to an end and didn't qualify. In other words, are we going to increase mental anguish and suffering amongst those, for example, with severe arthritis or disabilities, who don't have a terminal point in time, but who equally feel their quality of life is so bad that they should also be allowed to undertake this pathway, and therefore in establishing such one in a limited framework, are we not going to cause potential issues for others and potentially cause greater anguish in that age group or amongst those who also feel that their lives have reached such a point that they should be granted the wish to end it at that particular point? Thank you.
Well, the Honourable Member for Douglas Central, Mr Thomas.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the answer to already asked questions from the mover, and I wanted to add a little bit to some of those questions and ask a couple of new ones. The first one is building on something that Hayward said. Perhaps the mover could give a very clear description of the difference between the legislated assisted dying pathway and the options available at the moment to participate in decisions around withdrawing drugs and withdrawing water and withdrawing food, because I think the mover slightly created a straw man when he was presenting the Liverpool pathway around this, because I think he talked about no consent and no information and no choice, and I can imagine a situation where you have choice and consent and information in that alternative pathway to assisted dying. I think it would be very helpful for all of us to have that difference specified at this stage. The second one is I was absolutely delighted that the mover had actually followed up a suggestion I think I made in the private briefing about the carve-out with the General Medical Council, and I'd be very, very keen to know whether there have ever been any carve-outs like the one that's envisaged, and what the reaction was of the General Medical Council to the possibility of a carve-out for our little island in the middle of the Irish Sea, surrounded by parliaments that haven't as yet gone as far as we would be going, it seems, with this legislation. And moving on beyond the medical professional community, I want to go into the world of lawyers and law, and it's building on something that Mr Glover raised. You know, he's asked about the royal assent, but beyond any possible royal assent, I do think that in the world of Equality Act and safeguarding and things like that, it's very important in our island to understand that we would then be subject to cases and precedent and guidance that would come from through the legal system, and I wonder what extent it's possible to envisage the Isle of Man having its own separate approach to this important stage of life, different from what's going on in England and Wales and around us elsewhere. The third one is to really build on the idea of whether the timing of this is quite right, especially in relation to the capacity legislation. It's important legislation, and as yet still hasn't had its second reading. So I just wanted to know whether the mover thinks it's can perhaps even given an undertaking that this bill won't be drafted until the capacity legislation is fixed, because I think the mover would agree that there were times of frustration for everybody when he brilliantly and successfully changed abortion legislation, that issues came up too late through the process, and it would have been better to settle some policy questions early on. So perhaps it's better to actually wait till the capacity and anything else that's relevant is finally sorted before we even get to the process of applying legislative drafting resources. The next one is building on a question that Minister Hooper first raised, but he focused particularly on the Department of Health and Social Care aspects to this, and I wanted to extend it to Council of Ministers. Council of Ministers has a legislation committee, and it's now published its draft 5-year plan for legislation, and this bill doesn't appear in that 5-year legislation plan. So why is it that the mover thinks that this bill couldn't make the cut of even 5 years of legislation as a government programme, but it is offered here today? Is there some sort of structural reason in terms of the existing legislation that means that this has got to get in a queue behind several pieces that are in the government legislation programme? Of course, the government code is, although it's quite out of date, as has been admitted recently, it does actually cover the sort of issues that I can imagine that might be there in the Council of Ministers. For instance, it does deal with matters of conscience, it does deal with declared positions. It would have been perfectly easy for government to come with this approach and even make the honourable member who's here today responsible for taking this programme through. You know, there's no reason why important social legislation has to come from private members. In fact, the tradition in the island, as far as I can tell, just reading the textbook about this, is normally important social legislation perhaps gets postulated, put on the table by a private member, and then it gets taken over by government, and that's happened quite regularly over the last 3 or 4 decades. And then the final point I wanted to ask, and this builds on comments I perhaps misunderstood or misheard about the role of the courts in this, and then also a belief that the appropriate way forward would be a committee of the House rather than perhaps a select committee at the second reading. I wanted to agree again with Mr Glover that this issue didn't come up big time on the doorsteps of Douglas Central, but it did come up 10 times perhaps as I was walking around. And so, we had the discussion with the people who raised the issue, and quite a number of those people had the view that this was an incredibly important issue, but it might be better if the honourable member didn't take this issue through and raise it in public. Well able to do it, but an association with the fact that it's quite likely that certain points of view will be heard more than other points of view, and also the honourable member has also now had success and consequently established form in respect of this type of issue. So I just wonder whether the member could reflect and give an answer on whether it might be better, in fact, for somebody else rather than himself to actually be associated with beginning the public debate and taking this legislation forwards. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the honourable member for Douglas North, Mr. Wannenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support the introduction of this bill. I think the ability to choose how, where and when we die is a fundamental freedom, which cuts across political and ideological lines. Any change to the law in an area of such sensitivity and importance must be for the individual to consider as a matter of conscience. For me, that is the case. I campaigned on this, it was in my manifesto, and it was on many doors that I knocked on. This is very much an issue of our time. It is not ideological policy, nor is it out of touch, and it need not be dangerous or desperate. I recognise that this is a complex area with many safeguarding issues, and any and all laws must protect our most vulnerable in society, the elderly, the sick, the disabled, from being pressurised into ending their lives. And my support for the mover today is conditional on us achieving those safeguards. For those opposing the introduction of this bill, I respect their decision. That is their right, that is their choice. They should not deny that choice to anyone else. Many people will float away on palliative care. That is not the case for everyone, and I have seen that firsthand. One second. Mr. Glover says that we are alone. We are an outlier. I say we are trailblazer. We are leading the way on an enlightened path. Perhaps those deciding not to change the law should be sure that they have a clear idea as to what they are forcing other people to go through. Thank you.
Hear, hear. On the honourable member for Garth, Mrs. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a very emotive subject, and I think underlying it all is human compassion. And it's very hard representing a constituency always to know what the constituency is feeling. And like Mr Thomas, Honourable Member for Douglas Central, I had this subject raised with me several times, perhaps a dozen times this time, less frequently the previous election. But also, after receiving my manifesto, I did receive a flurry of emails in support. In 2016, in my manifesto, I put a single blob under other issues saying I would support abortion law reform and assisted dying for the terminally ill under very controlled circumstances. And then, with it being raised on the doorstep in 2021, I included, under other issues, I support consulting the community on enabling assisted dying to be an option for terminally ill people. And I stand by that. And I appreciate the people whose Christian values, religious views, or other emotions make it an issue for them. But we are here to represent all our constituents. And for me, there are parallels with the abortion reform bill in that this gives people a choice. And giving people choice means it is available. And I was very struck in some of the speakers that Dr Allinson brought before us, who said, I think it was a third of people maybe go through having taken up that option for assisted dying. But the problem for me is that it is an option that is available to people now if they have the means. So if you have the money and the determination and the strength towards the end of your life, you are able to go over to Dignitas. And the fact that that is only available to those who have means makes it uncomfortable for me to think, is that the best way forward for our island? And I appreciate there have been difficulties, and other legislations in our neighbouring jurisdictions have not progressed this legislation, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at it for our people, for the Isle of Man people. I know that I would have liked it to have been an option when my father was struggling. I know that I've seen a child as well of mine struggle. And I think when I see the leave to introduce mentions adult, I wonder if that could be an aspect that is consulted on. What is the age? You know, at 16, we give people on the Isle of Man the right to vote, the right to go in the army, to get married with parental consent, but you can pay tax. So are we saying that in some cases 16, it's the legal age of consent for sexual relations? Who is an adult? And I would say that my 4-year-old, when he was ill, was very well aware of his condition. He asked the consultant, is lithium a cure for cancer? And his neurosurgeon said, ask your oncologist. How did he pick up so much at the age of 4? And if he had progressed and things hadn't gone well, which they did go well, and he's completely fine, but if things hadn't gone well, would he be a child? Would this not be an option for a good death for a person under the age of 16 or 18? So I wonder where that is under the equality law. And I would say absolutely, having put my thoughts in the manifesto very briefly, because this is a vast subject and we need to consult everybody on it, and we need to find the right way forward for our island. But most of all, we need to have compassion for those people, for whatever reason, facing terminal illness, who cannot withstand whatever pain or lack of dignity they are facing, and have that option and that choice to end their life at the time of their choosing. And the other point that I would say that I was really struck in all the speakers that have appeared before us on this subject was how marvellous that somebody, knowing they are terminally ill, to have a fantastic family party, have a party to say goodbye and to reflect on a life well lived if you're fortunate to get to a great age, and then know that you can go quietly take the medication and fall away to sleep. I would like to be 100 and die in my sleep, a happy, contented grandmother or great-grandmother. But that may not happen, and in 10, 15, 20, 50 years, what would I want there as an option? I would not want, having witnessed it, I would not want my children to have to see me suffer. And I would say, this is not mandating a course. It does not take away from the fantastic palliative care of hospice and other organisations, but this gives a choice for people for a compassionate, dignified death. And I absolutely support that we need to consult the community about it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Call the honourable member for Douglas East, Ms Farger.
Goramaya Lorda. I want to thank Dr Allinson for bringing this, and would firstly like to say that I'm supportive of the principle, and I really do welcome this opportunity to bring a greater level of compassion, dignity and respect to many people at end of life. This is something that was in my manifesto. I've been a long-time supporter of updating legislation around this, and I've long been a member of information groups on this issue. And I've undertaken to keep informed about it, and I believe, therefore, that my position is research and evidence-based. I would like to follow on from some of the other questions about the strain on healthcare and ask the honourable member if he's given any consideration to what resource might be required and how we might manage that. But primarily, I rise to support this leave to introduce. We have an opportunity to bring progression in legislation and to bring dignity to people at end of life. It's right for members to raise concerns, but important to say that adequate safeguarding will bring choice, it will not bring coercion, and that choice will give dignity and release from anguish and pain for many people. This is something that I can wholeheartedly support. Thank you.
Call the honourable member for Douglas South, Mrs Christian.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd also like to thank Dr Allinson for bringing this forward, and I'd also like to thank members for their honesty here today, because it's been quite moving, and hearing everybody's thoughts about this and what you're bringing to the table from your constituencies, it's really important, and has really demonstrated to me how the good that we can do and when we work together. I have concerns, and the idea around this stems from, like other people here, a personal situation, and in the sense that decisions by members of my family, if that was there, it would make a very big deal to their lives. Whether that's what I want, selfishly, I can't put what I want first. I have to think about what they want, and I do believe that that would help them. But that aside, I want to pick up on certain points that members have raised, and they have been my worries too, and I hope the honourable member could really sort of clarify some situations. Certainly from the evidence that he's provided to us, it's been about healthcare in the US, and we have a very different healthcare system over here, and so I really would be interested in how that's translated, because the examples that we saw of the GP, he was a private medical centre that only dealt with assisted dying, and they dealt with as Minister Edge has described, the whole wraparound service, everything, and it was really quite remarkable. We don't have that, and that is a huge resource, and I'm hoping the Minister can sort of give a couple of clarifications on that and really sort of say how we are different. Our NHS system is different to that in the US, and what the ramifications of that are, and how are we going to get around that when you're looking at practicalities like, and I don't like to talk about the practicalities because it's difficult to, but you know, the ambulance service, who comes to collect you, the grieving process is different, not just for you making that decision, but also for your family. You know, what's the capacity for counselling, for afterwards, for the families? It's a great deal more than what's happening now, and we're already struggling. So those are my. I have concerns of the. It sounds an awful and an incompassionate way to say, but the logistics of it. But I need to know that that's possible, that we do have that capacity to do that and to manage this in exactly the same way that we saw that amazing private centre in the US that you brought to us. To you know, if I could get those assurances that that's what we could provide, then I would feel really happier for this. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Call the honourable member for Douglas East, Mrs. Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Excuse me. Debates about assisted dying have happened a number of times in this honourable court and in the other place, as outlined by a number of members today. Comments from members with differing views have always come from a position of compassion, and I think that remains an important principle to remember. We are all approaching this debate from a position of compassion. The many people who raised it with me during the election campaigns and in the intervening periods have also come at this from a position of compassion. And having raised this in my manifesto, I have had many conversations in support of this principle. And equally, some people who've raised questions around the safeguards that would need to be in place. Dr Allinson is correct that this has not been rushed, far from it. But while we have been talking, there have been people with terminal illnesses, frustrated that they have not had all the options available to them, frustrated that they haven't been able to take control of their death to make it a good death. Not a death that someone else thinks is good for them, but a death that they know is good for themselves. I'm delighted to see that today the concept of a good death has been talked about quite often, but it can often feel alien to many people. But when you've seen both good and bad deaths, the difference is stark. I am privileged to have supported many patients in their death, in nursing homes, in intensive care, in the emergency department, in hospice, and on the general wards. I have always strived to ensure that those for whom I have cared have had a good death, but it has not always been possible. For some, they have been unable to access a way out from uncontrollable suffering. They have been distressed. Their family and friends have been distressed, rendered helpless. As a nurse, I have sometimes found myself unable to act, finding myself only able to support the patient in their suffering, as medicine cannot always provide a relief from it. We are fortunate to have a most incredible hospice and hospice team, as well as many other nurses across our health services and doctors and the additional teams who support, providing palliative care with a degree of compassion and skill that is second to none. My support of Dr Allinson's proposed leave to introduce does not detract from that. Rather, it is praise for it. It would be wholly inappropriate to introduce legislation for assisted dying where the palliative care was insufficient or lacking. Assisted dying should be one of a series of options, never the only option. Today we're being asked, in principle, to agree to allow Dr Allinson to introduce a private member's bill to enable adults who are terminally ill to be provided at their request with specified assistance to end their own life. By breaking down the specific wording, we can understand the broad positioning of some of the safeguards already been committed to. That this will be available to adults, to those who have a diagnosed terminal illness, to those who can request it, and to those who are able to end their own lives. The details of these elements will, of course, need to be considered through the policy-level consultation that Dr Allinson has already described. Dr Allinson has a track record of engaging with the public on important issues, of comprehensive consultation, and of a keenness to work with honourable members on any required amendments with the goal of having a piece of legislation on our statute books that is fit for the future. The conversations about what those safeguards should look like and the details of our legislation that must be specific to our island will be part of that discussion and debate. We must all be involved, as must the wider community. Death is still, for many, a taboo. Many would rather not talk about it. Yet how someone dies can often form a significant part of our memories of them. We regret things we didn't do, and we question things that were not possible. It is always better to talk about death when it is not knocking on your door, to explore what we want and what is available to us, and to ensure that those around us know how best to support us to make those important choices. So I go back briefly to the concept of a good death. I have nursed patients with intractable diseases and unbearable symptoms where the prospect of staying alive is worse than the prospect of dying. A good death may look different for everyone, but in my experience, freedom from suffering is a universal request, whether it be physical or mental suffering. Providing the legal framework for a range of options for people who find themselves in challenging end-of-life situations is for us as lawmakers. Today we have an opportunity to tentatively start the journey to allowing autonomy for this final, dignified choice. I would urge members to support Dr Allinson in his leave to introduce. Thank you.